Welcome to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show. And now, your host, Tim Johnson.
Welcome to the all-new Louisiana Business and Industry Show. We've taken a few months off, but we're back and hopefully better than ever. Louisiana faces huge budget deficits this fiscal year and next. New taxes are on the table that could affect the business community. Stephen Waguespack, president of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, joins us when we return on the Louisiana Business and Industry Show.
Since 1919, we've designed and constructed hundreds of industrial plants, roads, ships, dams, and executed some of the most complex jobs in the world. In fact, our quality and dependability are legendary. Today, the legend continues as Brown & Root delivers engineering, construction, maintenance, and industrial specialty services throughout the U.S. and the world from our headquarters here in Louisiana. We are Brown & Root.
In Baton Rouge, see your good neighbor State Farm agent Brady Flavin for your insurance and financial needs.
For over a quarter century, Kelly's has operated with honesty, integrity, and above all, safety. Kelly's features a fleet of quality equipment operated by dedicated, safety-minded employees skilled in land clearing, above-ground right-of-way maintenance, vegetation control, station yard and manned facility maintenance, above-ground pipeline support, and more. Kelly's Industrial Services, where pipeline right-of-way maintenance gets done right.
Consumers and property owners with construction projects can have a successful result or regretful experiences that could have been avoided. Before any construction project, verify licensure of the contractor and check references. Scammers will claim to be insured or bonded, so always check first. Download our app, LA Contractor, from the Android or Apple Store. Visit our website, lacontractor.org, or contact the Louisiana State Licensing Board for Contractors. We're here to help before things go wrong. Hire a licensed contractor. It's the law.
Welcome back to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show with Tim Johnson.
Welcome back to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show. Very pleased to be joined by Stephen Waguespack. He is the president of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. Stephen, welcome.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
A lot to talk about, my friend.
A lot.
We're going to get into some of these budget issues and the new governor and the new administration a little bit later, but let's start by recapping the last 8 years in terms of the business climate in our state. Governor Jindal did a lot of good things, other things he's been criticized for. What did he get wrong, and where could he have done more?
Yeah, and I think every governor, when they come in and once they leave, there's probably a hits and misses story to tell. And I think when it comes to the past administration, on the jobs front, we really did do a good job in attracting new companies here in Louisiana, new investments. So we did broaden our worker base, which was very helpful. I think the ethics reforms that happened early in the session did, in state, there's been a lot of scrutiny back and forth, whether the effect of it, but outside the state, I think people looked at Louisiana differently for the first time. And so where we used to be bunched in with states like New Jersey and Illinois and some of those other things, we're not viewed that way anymore. We're viewed as a state that took a hard stand. And so that does help, with your ability to portray yourself to companies that want to come invest here. So that was a big play there.
Also, and again, it's one of those things that is viewed from the exterior, but these rankings that a lot of these economic development magazines, site selection magazines, where we've improved significantly in our business climate, the view of our business climate overall. I know that that's something that the governor and Stephen Moray, his previous Secretary of Economic Development,
yeah, those things matter. I mean, when these big international companies or these big national companies are looking to where to bring their jobs investment, they kind of have a Match.com type of analysis of it. And so they look for the rankings and they try to figure out where that personality profile fits. And when they see the rankings improve, they say, let's go take a second look. And so I think that has been a big fit there. The other thing I would mention is I think the emergency response that we've seen over the last 8 years, we've kind of rebranded Louisiana as being a very effective state as far as dealing with adversity, dealing with some of the challenges. And I think that's a good story to tell on that front as well.
We've exported a lot of that expertise as well. I mean, Hurricane Sandy, a lot of Louisiana first responders and technology and equipment and expertise going up to New Jersey, New York to help with them. So there's been a lot of that very positive PR for the state as well.
And look, I tell you, that's a good point. You know, I actually went up to New Jersey during that time and met with some of their early days there, some of their government officials trying to figure out how to respond to that. And it was a good reminder on how ahead of the curve we were down here, and they were, cutting their teeth on some of the issues we had, learned through hard lessons over the previous decade.
Well, I think if you go back certainly to Governor Mike Foster, in the early to mid '90s, and through Governor Blanco on to Governor Jindal, I think what you've seen is we have really repositioned ourselves. We're no longer the state that's always first in everything that's bad and last in everything that's good. We've moved up. Now, as we mentioned in the original question, there are some who say the governor could have done more. Mm-hmm. Where are those areas you feel like we've missed opportunity over the last 8 years?
Well, I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the budget deficits. We have the chronic deficits, and it's the biggest challenge facing our state right now on the government side. We've got economic headwinds we're facing, but on the government side, it's the biggest challenge we have there. So, the fact that we still have that lingering issue, and we've been lingering in this environment for the last several years, I would say by far that's the biggest work to do that's been left hanging over for the next administration. And
we're going to get into those budget deficits in some detail as we go along here, but give our viewers a general overview of the business climate in Louisiana as exists today. What is reality? How is it viewed from the outside? Mm-hmm. Where do we stand?
Well, if a year ago we were having this conversation, the conversation's about the big industrial boom, 60 billion to 100 billion new projects. Our biggest challenge a year ago was how do we find the workers for all these great jobs? That was a good problem to have. If you fast forward a year to today, we've lost 11,000 of those jobs, 10,000 in the oil and gas sector alone. That's 20% of that sector. And so what that tells me is that where you stand depends on where you sit in Louisiana. And if you're in Lake Charles, you're expecting 7.1% growth over the next year. Those industrial projects are coming online. There's a lot of movement there. If you're in Baton Rouge, you're expecting over about 2.5% growth over this year because of the big industrial contractors helping to build some of that petrochem, and also some of the petrochem we have here, in between here and New Orleans on the I-10 corridor. If you're not in those two regions, it's a much different story. Over the last year, we've seen those projections dip. Most of the other regions in the state are in the red or in the neutral on their way to red. If you're in Lafayette, down to 49, into, on your way to Houma, Morgan City, those areas, oil and gas sector is tremendously nervous right now. Some of the, the banks and all the others we're starting to hear from, there's some of their members are starting to come in worried about making notes. You are going to see over the first quarter to mid part of this year, unfortunately, layoffs, rollbacks, consolidations, mergers, sales, things that we don't like to read in our headlines. If you look at rig counts throughout the state, we're at the lowest level since the 80s, and we're still trending down. And so, certain pockets of the state have a good story to tell. Petrochem, industrial construction, chemical, those areas are doing well because of natural gas prices. If you're not in one of those three buckets, you're facing a pretty stiff headwind right now, and it's challenging.
And as you mentioned, this oil and gas situation is not only critical in terms of what it does to our economy and jobs, but particularly with the tax base in the state as well. We've got about 2 minutes left in this segment, so I want to jump into the current fiscal year deficit, short term. If you've read the papers, you've followed the news, you know that for this fiscal year that ends at the end of June, the 15-16 fiscal year, the state faces about a $750 million shortfall. Legislature raised $700 million in taxes last year, yet we still see ourselves in this short-term deficit. How did we get here?
Well, there's a longer issue. How did we get here? There's a much longer 50-year story that I think needs to be told, and I think we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later on the show. But as far as this current piece, if you look at last year's session, they did not pass $700 million. They passed what they thought were $700 million. What happened was the market responded. We just talked about the market and the economy is weak. It's fragile right now. You can't just, gin up the tax machine and expect the dollars to flow in. And when you put that on the market is going to respond. People scaled back. People rolled off, people went out of state, and I think that's what was happening there. So when they thought they were raising $700 to address the deficit, those dollars have been coming in lower because the economy responded. And I think that's what's going to happen anytime we depend solely on revenue to solve our budget challenges in government.
And you're right. We're going to talk about those long-term structural issues and the larger deficits that we face next year. But even things like taking tax credits early, filing taxes early. You're right. The market did respond, and the business community is always going to do that. It's simple economics as we see it. We'll take a break. We come back, I want to jump into the proposals that the governor has made to address the $750 million shortfall this year and the $1.9 billion shortfall next year. A lot of revenue issues on the table. They will significantly impact the business community, and we'll talk about that when we come back from the break. You're watching the Louisiana Business and Industry Show.
For more than 25 years, the TJC Group has been helping industry communicate and build relationships with communities, elected officials, and governmental agencies. We are the leading firm in the U.S. for the development, management, and facilitation of industry-based community advisory panels.
Whether you're building a new facility or you manage an existing business, let us put our community and governmental relations experience to work for you.
The TJC Group, facilitating solutions for business and industry.
It might be one of the most efficient, most effective methods of communications we've ever used.
Since 1919, we've designed and constructed hundreds of industrial plants, roads, ships, dams, and executed some of the most complex jobs in the world. In fact, our quality and dependability are legendary. Today, the legend continues as Brown & Root delivers engineering, construction, maintenance, and industrial specialty services throughout the U.S. and the world from our headquarters here in Louisiana. We are Brown & Root.
For over a quarter century, Kelly's has operated with honesty, integrity, and above all, safety. Kelly's features a fleet of quality equipment operated by dedicated, safety-minded employees skilled in land clearing, above-ground right-of-way maintenance, vegetation control, station yard and manned facility maintenance, above-ground pipeline support, and more. Kelly's Industrial Services, where pipeline right-of-way maintenance gets done right.
Welcome back to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show with Tim Johnson.
Welcome back to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show. We're visiting with Stephen Waguespack. He's the president of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. And we talked at the end of the last segment, Stephen, about the $750 million shortfall we face in this fiscal year state. We've got a $1.9 billion shortfall estimated, at least that much going forward in fiscal year 16-17. Within the last week or so, new Governor John Bell Edwards and Commissioner of Administration Jay Darden have announced some plans to try to address the shortfall this year. A couple of things they've talked about: tapping the state's rainy day fund, redirecting some of the first-year BP settlement money from the oil spill, 10% cut in a lot of the statutory dedications. But most of their solutions involve new revenue. A clean penny in state sales tax, repeal of the exemption on business utilities, which has been critical for the expansion, I think, of the petrochemical and refining industries in our state. Suspending the tax credit for business inventory, that'll raise about $45 million. Sales tax collections on internet purchases. Suspending the net operating loss deduction for corporate income tax. So a number of measures that will raise taxes specifically on the business community. Let's talk about each one of those individually. Sure. And Lobby's position on those. Sure.
So from a revenue only perspective, I mean, I think what we're seeing as the plan is we're going to lean hard on new revenue, and it's similar to what we saw last year, and we saw that didn't work. The dollars came in less than we thought. The deficits are still there. I mean, when you look at our budget, our biggest challenges are spending and a broken budget structure, not necessarily revenue. But having said that, they're proposing a host of revenue, what's called a menu of options. And what they rolled out, as you mentioned a couple, there are actually 23 different revenue raisers on that proposal, on that menu, if you will. There weren't 23 spending cuts, there weren't 23 budget reforms that went with it, it was just revenue. So our biggest concern is, each one we can talk about, but the biggest concern is the approach to just use revenue to solve that budget crisis. We don't think it's going to solve budget problems for the state, and we definitely don't think it's going to solve budget problems for some of the private, enterprises out there in the economy. As far as each one, they all have a different story to tell. So on the clean penny, if you will, for those that are...
Explain what we mean when we say a clean penny.
Sure. So Louisiana, like most other states, has a sales tax. And what's a little different from here, we have a state tax, sales tax, and a local sales tax that piggyback on top of each other. Collectively, we're pretty high in the country right now at a sales tax.
Generally around 9 cents, 9%.
About 9 cents. Sometimes it gets a little higher than that depending on the local level. And so what happens is whenever you apply a sales tax, there are two things, exemptions and exclusions. Some people are excluded from paying the sales tax, like we have in the Constitution an exclusion for food and drugs for residential use. That's an exclusion. You're not charged that. Some people are charged a tax, yet an exemption has been put in over the years to say, while you're charged to it, we're not going to force you to pay it because of some other economic development goal or personal income goal. And so we've done that over the years. And so a clean penny means we're going to add a penny to the sales tax and no exemptions will apply. And so that's where they say clean penny. And the projection is it could bring in somewhere to $900 million to $1 billion
over an entire fiscal year, right? But it's somewhere around 200 for this fiscal
in the
year,
remaining several months here. So if that penny goes on, it will put Louisiana as the top sales tax in the country. Obviously in a tight economy like we have right now, when you're out, whether buying goods and services for your business or goods and services for your home, that's going to add a cost. And so now the upside, if you would, it's evenly distributed. Everyone, is
Everyone
charged
pays it, right.
It's a consumption tax, and so if you don't want to pay it, you don't go buy that good or service. So if you can scale back, you would. And so there is some ability for a citizen to control that tax. But having said that, anything that's going to put you into the top regressive tax in the country, it's a challenge.
Well, and one of the things that's a concern, particularly for industry, right, is that over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, we've worked with the legislature and we've worked with the administrations in place at the time to repeal what was one of the only taxes of its kind in the country, right? There are very few states that charge industry for a sales tax on the utilities that industry uses. We had that tax in place. We were able to repeal it over time. Now, obviously, that tax is back on the table at the 4 cents that were repealed, and now the extra clean penny that we talked about would actually make that tax 5 cents or 5% on business utilities in the state, a major concern for industry.
Correct. And when you talk about utilities, a lot of times we talk about business utilities. I think it's important to remember utilities are not taxed in the state for businesses or individuals. So at your home level, when you get that bill, you're not taxed on it. That protection for an individual is in the Constitution. The same protection is given for business, yet it's not in the Constitution. And so when they talk about removing that exemption, it's not necessarily an exemption. It is the same protection given to the individuals throughout this state. It just simply is not in the Constitution, so that means you can go grab it with a lower vote threshold. And that's the only reason why it comes into place to a certain extent. And to your point, it has absolutely been critical in some of these big expansion projects we've seen that have created jobs, especially along the river area. Electric costs go, a big part into it. What's not often talked about is the small business impact. I mean, petrochem's one thing. They do pay a big electric bill. But so does your mom and pop corner market down the street, and that does add cost to them as well.
And as you talked about before, obviously business responds to whatever's happening in the market. One of the things we've talked about is the ability to grow industry in our state, create new jobs, create a greater tax pie. And obviously this could impact that.
Yeah, and just two other you mentioned. I'll just real briefly talk about. You mentioned inventory and losses. Well, think about it. I just talked about the economy right now. There's going to be losses. We know that over the next year, people are going to be losing their mind. At the same time, when that happens, adding a new tax on their losses, very difficult time to kick someone while they're down. And so that is a concerning tax there as well. And the inventory tax, we've spoken ad nauseum about that. This is a big challenge. We are one of the few states in the country that tax inventory. Whether that's a car in the car dealer lot, or whether that's a big valve in someone's machine shop, or whether that is liquid product in a tank farm, ready to be shipped across the world to meet an energy supply. That's all inventory that we tax in Louisiana. And there's a credit put on that to make it not as condemning to our economic success. And over the years, that's been a little bit of a neutral fire there. If you remove that credit, you expose that tax, you are going to incentivize inventory to leave this state.
It's one more revenue-raising measure, obviously, that is concerning the business community. I want to come back from this break and really get into LBIS recommendations for long-term structural changes. We're visiting with Stephen Waguespack. He's the president of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, and you're watching the Louisiana Business and Industry Show.
For For more than 20 years, the TJC Group has been helping companies assess their training needs and to develop programs that improve the effectiveness and productivity of their teams.
Training doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. Let us put our experience and expertise to work for you.
The TJC Group, facilitating solutions for business and industry.
It might be one of the most efficient, most effective methods of communications we've ever used.
In Baton Rouge, see your good neighbor State Farm agent Brady Flavin for your insurance and financial needs.
Consumers and property owners with construction projects can have a successful result or regretful experiences that could have been avoided. Before any construction project, verify licensure of the contractor and check references. Scammers will claim to be insured or bonded, so always check first. Download our app, LA Contractor, from the Android or Apple Store. Visit our website, lacontractor.org, or contact the Louisiana State Licensing Board for Contractors. We're here to help before things go wrong. Hire a licensed contractor. It's the law.
Welcome back to the Louisiana Business and Industry Show. We're visiting with Stephen Waguespack, the president of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. Stephen, we recognize clearly that we find ourselves in a very familiar place in Louisiana, these budget deficits. LBIS has done some research, undertook the research in 2015. You released your budget research series, 3 white papers. A, understanding the state's budget deficit. B, a closer look at locked up spending. We'll talk about that. And then recommendations for budget reform. Let's talk about long-term solutions now. What's your perspective?
Our perspective is this: over the last 10 years, our budget spending rate has grown 44%, and our economy has grown about 25% over the same time period.
That's a ratio that's completely out of whack, right?
No, I mean, no entity, whether you're a business or a government, can really survive outspending your economic growth by about 2 to 1. But that's what we've done. And we all know what happened was in 2005, we were about $17 billion as a budget. We spiked in the days after Katrina, whenever the false economy came in. We had temporary, income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes. We had recovery dollars come in. Our budget ballooned about, up to $29 billion in only a couple of years. $12 billion growth.
From 17 to 29
Correct.
in the course of just a few years.
Correct.
Right.
So what happens is when that false economy pulls back out, that number has to come back down, or you have to raise a lot of taxes to survive. And so we've brought it down some. We're down about $25 billion now, but over the last 6 years, instead of continuing that,
Right.
come back to reality, we've kind of patched it together over the years, and that's, one of the misses we've had over the last couple of years. And so now what we have is we've got a $25 billion budget that doesn't really meeting our needs. We have a $25 billion budget that doesn't match our economy. We've got a $25 billion budget that can't find dollars to spend in higher ed and healthcare. It doesn't make sense. And it's because we've got this patchwork web of landmines and lockboxes throughout our budget, which prohibits legislators and governors and policymakers from spending on priorities. Instead, all those dollars flow out of Baton Rouge on cruise control to predestined destinations from years and years and years ago of all these dedications that are put in place.
It's something in the neighborhood of 400 statutory and
Correct.
Constitutional dedications that sort of prescribe where that money's going without regard to what our real priorities might be in state government. And you mentioned education, healthcare, infrastructure development, those sort of things that we want to be able to focus money on, that locked up spending. Now, let's talk about that $25.1 billion state budget now. and you mentioned not all of that, or not all of those are state dollars, state
Correct.
general fund dollars. About half of that, so to speak. Give our viewers an understanding of the $25.1 billion. What percentage of that are federal dollars that are flowing through, and what percentage of that is state dollars that are generated here?
Sure. So you got a $25 billion budget. About 9 of that is federal dollars, and so that number goes up and up as the last several years. But about $9 billion. So you take that off the top. So let's say you're right around $16 billion. Of that 16, only $2.9 billion is discretionary general fund, what we call it. Those are free dollars to invest in healthcare, higher ed, or corrections. Those are the 3 areas that live in that 2.9. Right. So that's why whenever you hear of a deficit and they say fine $1 billion, your common sense says, wait a minute, $1 billion out of 25? Piece
not a
of
big
cake.
deal, but it's not out of 25.
It's not out of 25.
Right.
It's out of 2.9, and that's the challenge we face. And so if we don't unlock the other parts of that budget, make that 2.9 5.9, 6.9, give policymakers more ability to use existing dollars more flexibly. Until we do that, the only answer is always going to be, I need more money, I need more money, I need more money, because we're not letting them use the dollars they have today more effectively. And it can change anytime we want.
Well, and it prohibits us from actually focusing on priorities. I know this is an oversimplification, and I've shared this with you before, and you and I have talked about it, but the way we ought to be budgeting, I believe, in Louisiana is saying, what is our number one priority? Is it education? Then let's figure out what a world-class system of education looks like in Louisiana and how much it costs and fund it. If infrastructure is number 2, what does a world-class system look like and how much does it cost, and let's fund it. If healthcare is number 3, public safety, whatever. But once we get to priority number 4 or 5, we say, all right, we've funded our main priorities adequately. We're going to demand excellence from them. And guys, you fight over what's left for all the other things you may want to do in state government, but we're going to get these priorities right. We don't do that in our state, do we?
It's a great point, and Reagan had a great quote, and basically he said, government needs to view through the eyes of the entrepreneur. They need to figure out what does government need to do to meet the needs of the people as compared to vice versa. And it's so true, we don't do that. Every year our only discussion is this: how do we meet the needs of government? We never flip that question, and that's one of our biggest challenges. Besides the dedicated funds, we've got expenditure growth in our budget, which is choking us to death. A couple examples. Medicaid has gone up $1.1 billion over the last 10 years. Our pension costs are hundreds of millions of dollars every year. That puts a struggle on state budgets and education budgets because it takes dollars out of the classroom. We have refused to address any of those. So you can keep throwing tax dollars to that problem all you want. If you don't control some of the spending growth, it's a bottomless bucket you will never fill up.
And we've got to address it, and we've got to make adult conversations and make tough decisions. We got about a minute left. In 30 seconds or so, legislative session coming up in a week or so, what do you expect?
I expect to be a lot of interesting plot twists and turns. I would say stay tuned, and every day show up for work and be prepared for anything, because I hear a lot of menus of options. I hear a lot of let's all get to the table. What I don't hear is here's a specific plan and here's where we're going to get to a different end result. And so, it's a concern, but it's also an opportunity. Maybe this is the one chance where we are going to look at opening up our budget. We are going to look at fixing some entitlement dollars. And whatever revenue we do, we can do it in a way that fixes our tax code to make us more competitive for the economy and for the state. That's what I'm hoping for.
10 seconds, how critically important is it that the business community be engaged?
It's never been more critical in years. I would say 1987 was the last time it was as critical for them to make their voice heard.
We'll be watching closely. Stephen Waguespack, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That's a wrap, guys. Tune in next week at this very same time for another edition of the Louisiana Business and Industry Show.